Hello, this is Ian Fox. Welcome to From Tancredi to Turandot, the 8th in my 13-part series tracing the history of Italian opera, from its beginnings in Florence at the end of the 16th century to today. The year 1813 had considerable significance in music. On May the 22nd, in Leipzig, Richard Wagner was born, and in Le Roncole, a tiny village near Busseto, some 70 miles southeast of Milan, the local innkeeper's wife had a son on October the 9th. Their name was Green, and they called him Joseph Fortune Francis, or, in Italian, Giuseppe Fortuno Francisco Verdi. Giuseppe's parents were simple village people, but when they saw his fascination with music, they bought him a broken-down spinet. His progress was rapid, and it was arranged for him to go to school in Busseto, where he boarded with a wealthy local family, the Barezzis. They helped him pursue his interest, and his whole life became music. By the age of 15, he'd had a cantata successfully performed, and it was decided he should sit the entrance examination for Milan Conservatory, but he failed the test. Many years later, when they asked his permission to rename the conservatory after him, his terse comment was, "They wouldn't have me young, they can't have me old." Fortunately, one examiner was impressed, and arranged for classes with the chief conductor at La Scala. Over the next 2 years, Verdi made rapid progress, and in 1836, at the age of 23, married the daughter of his adopted household, Margherita Barezzi, and started earning his living as an organist in Busseto. During the winter of 1837, he finished an opera, Oberto, and the authorities at La Scala were impressed, offering to stage it. But the tenor went ill, and the project was cancelled. A famous young soprano, mistress to La Scala's impresario Merelli, thought very highly of the piece and helped to get it staged. She was Giuseppina Strepponi, later to be the second Mrs. Verdi. The premiere went well, and the opera was seen in Turin, Genoa and Naples. Now La Scala wanted a comedy, but Verdi was in no real mood for fun. His 2 children had died as babies, and now his beloved wife took ill and suddenly died as well. So the young composer found himself without wife or children in the space of 2 years. He completed the comedy, Un giorno di regno, King for a Day, but its first performance, at La Scala, in November 1839, was a flop, despite some fine music.
Mio signor, la strada è questa, per cui voglio andar di là. Mio signor, la strada è questa, per cui voglio andar di là. Per cui voglio andar di là. Per cui voglio andar di là. E che dice che da lì risolve che si degna che l'impulso pari a vada e tutta a cavallo delle notti. Alle sola d'un villano sta la bella vincia in un guerrier valia valente sotto spada da attaccare. Io son questa spada in queste noi c'è ganda misura, noi c'è ganda misura, noi c'è ganda misura, la mia moda è assai più spiccia, quella io voglio, vedere. Venga lei, con la miccia, con la spada, col barino, può colorre, non volevo, ci nei colpi vivano con un bastone, da miser di castigar, al servizio anch'io persone che san bene bastonar. Sudo avanto, sbaglio, tremo, il mio petto è mongibello, se più resto il mio cervello incomincia a rivoltar. Per uscire passo estremo, il rimedio è stato bello, che mi prendo bello, che mi dico, che mi fa, sì, questo è il cervello, che non mi già ne può far, che non mi già ne può far, che non mi già ne può far, che non mi già ne può far,
Thomas Hampson and Samuel Ramey in part of a duet from Un giorno di Regno. With such a series of family tragedies and a failed opera, Verdi decided he'd had enough of composing for the theatre. He stayed in Milan for a while, however, and one day Morelli met him in the street and gave him a new libretto, asking him to think again. Reluctantly, he took it home and threw it on the bed. Legend has it, and Verdi was fond of embellishing the facts about himself later on, that he later glanced at the verses where the book had fallen open and suddenly was inspired by the stirring words about freedom from oppression. At this time, the north of Italy was under Austrian rule, and a hymn to freedom touched his heart. When the melody was sung by the Hebrew slaves in their Israelite imprisonment, the message came across loud and clear, particularly with the tune he'd come up with. The chorus of the Hebrew slaves from Nabucco, with the chorus and orchestra of Covent Garden under Lamberto Gardelli. Nabucco was a smash hit, and a new star was born. In the 9 years that were to follow, up to the breakthrough score for Rigoletto, Verdi was to write 2 or 3 operas a year. He later described this time as his years in the galley. What he produced may have been varied, but was often remarkable and sometimes outstanding. Morelli offered him a blank cheque for his next work, and Strepponi suggested he should ask for the same fee as Bellini had received for Norma. Verdi started work on The Lombards on the First Crusade. The Archbishop of Milan tried to have the work banned because he thought that on-stage baptism would be sacrilegious. What he would have made of modern theatres, goodness only knows. They changed the offending section, and the first performance took place at La Scala in February 1843. It was another triumph, and when the Lombard chorus sang, "Today the Holy Land will be ours," the audience broke out with cries of "Si!" Later, Verdi reworked it for Paris, changing the heroes into French crusaders and retitling it as Jerusalem, but either way, the opera didn't remain in the repertory long. The Fenice, Venice's great opera house, offered a contract, and Verdi suggested Shakespeare's King Lear. It was a theme that had bothered him for his entire career. He never got far with the score, and any drafts were destroyed at his death. Finally, he settled on Victor Hugo's play Ernani. A young local poet, Piave, was given the chance to provide the text. Again, the idea ran into censorship problems, but the work was staged at the Fenice in March 1844 and was reasonably successful, though he had a poor opinion of some of the singers involved in it. Ernani remains a fringe piece in the Verdi canon with occasional revivals. It contains much good music, though. Here's Elvira, who's been forced to marry her guardian Silva, hoping that her lover, the bandit Ernani, will appear before daylight breaks again. This is part of Rosa Poncel's famous recording of 1924. Rosa Poncel as Elvira in Ernani. Donizetti's last opera, Caterina Cornaro, had been given its first performance 2 months earlier, and already Verdi was being hailed as his successor. For his next work, he chose Byron's poem The Two Foscari. It was staged in Rome in November 1844, and after a shaky first night, gathered momentum, with over 30 curtain calls for the composer on the second evening. Here's Ramon Vargas with Jacopo's Caballetta Odio Solo, as he warns his fellow Venetians about the danger from those who hate them. Things haven't changed much in some ways since 1457.
Odio solo e odio dolce, in quell'anime si cela, saggioso lenta quella, da costo si farà, ma se foscari una voce, va donandomi nel cuore. Cosa contro il rigor, l'innocenza ti darà, l'innocenza ti darà. Odio solo e odio dolce, in quell'anime si cela, saggioso e da quella, da costo si farà, ma se foscari una voce, va donandomi nel cuore. Forza contro il rigor, l'innocenza ti darà, l'innocenza ti darà, l'innocenza ti darà, l'innocenza ti darà, l'innocenza ti darà.
Odio Solo from I Due Foscari, sung splendidly there by Ramon Vargas. Verdi oversaw a revival at La Scala later and was very annoyed about the lackadaisical standards there. Meanwhile, he started to work on an opera about Joan of Arc. Then La Scala put on I Due Foscari, staging the second and third acts the wrong way round. Verdi swore he would never let the famous theatre have another premiere, and indeed they had to wait 25 years before he relented with Otello. Giovanni d'Arco, meanwhile, had its first performance at La Scala in February 1845 without much success. And Verdi moved on to the great Naples house, the Teatro San Carlo, with a story set in Peru during the Spanish conquest, Alzira. The composer later described this flop as a proper brute, and it was soon dropped, though it had a fabulous first night on St. Patrick's Day in 1846. Forced to rest by his doctors, Verdi took a 6-month break. By the autumn, he felt well enough to get back to work. He toyed with two ideas, Schiller's play Die Räuber and Shakespeare's Macbeth. When he heard the Teatro Pergola in Florence didn't have a good tenor on its roster, he decided on Macbeth, giving the title role to a baritone. Here, for the first time, he put a huge amount of detailed work into the presentation of his opera. He was the first to insist on dramatic quality in the performances as much as the singing. He swatted up on Scottish history and costume design. He insisted on 151 rehearsals, even holding up the public dress rehearsal to finish his coaching. But the effort was well worthwhile. He was given 38 curtain calls, and the opera remains in the repertory, although he did revise it, of course, many years later. Here's Maria Callas as the haunted Lady Macbeth, trying to wash the blood from her hands and calling on Macbeth to get into bed. There's knocking at the gate, and they must appear to be asleep. Maria Callas as Lady Macbeth disappearing to bed in the 1958 recording with the Philharmonia conducted by Nicola Rescigno. Now he felt ready to tackle an offer from London, and Verdi got to work on Schiller's The Brigands, under the title of I Masnadieri. On his way to England, he stopped off in Paris to see Giuseppina Strapponi again, and has generally felt their relationship dates from this time. The first night, at Her Majesty's Theatre Haymarket in July 1847, was a star-studded occasion, with Jenny Lind in the lead. Despite the enthusiastic reception, the opera didn't stay in the repertory, though George Bernard Shaw was immensely fond of it and always kept a copy of the score on his piano. An opera for Trieste followed, Il Corsaro, based on Byron's The Corsair. Then the people of Milan rose up against their Austrian oppressors in March 1848 and held the city for 5 days. Verdi hurried there to join his comrades, and when the rising was quashed, he still decided to tackle a similar historical equivalent with the Battle of Legnano, a famous victory for the Milanese in 1176. It had a short-lived success at the start of 1849 when the Pope had fled Rome for a time, but was soon dropped when the status quo was restored. Another commission from the San Carlo in Naples arrived, and he took a play by Schiller to form the basis of Louisa Miller. It had its premiere in December 1849, but the management tried to dodge paying him, and he had to threaten to get the help of the French warships anchored in the bay. A local character is supposed to have cast an evil eye on the composer, and he was nearly killed by a piece of falling scenery. So a week after the successful opening of Louisa Miller, he left Naples swearing he'd never return, and he kept his word. Rodolfo is shown a faked letter in the opera, supposed to be written by his beloved to another. She betrayed me. She said in elegiac tones, "I love you," but she betrayed me. Here's Roberto Alagna. Roberto Alagna with the Berlin Philharmonic, conducted by Claudio Abbado. Verdi was drawn more and more to his hometown of Busetto as the years progressed. He bought a villa and a farm there and began to live the life of a country gentleman. Strepponi also moved in, to the disapproval of the local clergy, but Verdi always had scant regard for the church or officialdom of any kind. For the winter season at Trieste in 1850 he produced Stifalio, another example of the unusual plots he was favouring, this time about adultery amongst a strict Protestant sect in Germany. It had a cool reception, and Verdi 7 years later reworked his score into Aroldo. He then threw various ideas at his librettist Salvatore Camerano, who had previously worked with Donizetti. Finally, they chose Victor Hugo's Le Roi s'amuse for the carnival season in Venice in 1851. When the censors discovered the story was about a jester and a real French king, Francis I from around 1520, they banned the work. No true monarch could be seen on stage, even after 3 centuries. So the location was changed to the court of the Duke of Mantua, and the jester became Rigoletto. From its launch in March 1851, it was a huge success. Although Verdi didn't think of himself as an innovator, many of the ideas he's been trying out over the previous decade came together in Rigoletto. The old rigid system of set piece, with recitative followed by aria, was gone, with music flowing from scene to scene with a new freedom. The characters were well-rounded and quite credible, and the total effect is of a play set to music. The change was particularly noticeable in Parisiamo. Instead of an aria, Rigoletto is given a free-form monologue to express his feelings. It's the sort of thing Wagner was also experimenting with in his own way at the same time. Rigoletto is musing on the difference between himself and his high-flying master. We are alike, I have the words, you have the dagger. But he worries about an elderly courtier who had cursed him when he made a joke about him. He thinks about the Duke. He's young and jovial, so powerful and handsome. He calls to me as he falls asleep, "Fool, make me laugh!" And I have to do so. Damnation, that curse! I hate you, insolent courtiers. What happiness do I get snapping at your heels? If I am wicked, the fault is yours. This is no folly. Here's Cornell MacNeill.
Avesiamo io la lingua egli ha il pugnale l'uomo sanio che ride e quel che spegne. Faceste voi la rabbia esser difforme la rabbia esser buffone non dover non poter altro che ridere il retaggio d'ogni anne tolto questo padrone mio, Giove, giocondo, si possente, bello, sonnecchiando mi dice, fa che io rida, buffone, forzarmi deggio e farlo, oh, dannazione! Odio voi, cortigiani schernitori!
Ian Fox. Welcome to From Tancredi to Turandot, the 9th in my 13-part series tracing the history of Italian opera from its beginnings in Florence at the end of the 16th century to today. Last week we left Giuseppe Verdi in March 1851 with a huge success on his hands, the opera Rigoletto. In Paris alone there were 200 performances in its first season. But though the 37-year-old composer now seemed to have reached his pinnacle, life wasn't all cakes and ale. He'd bought a fine villa close to his birthplace near Busetto, and was living openly there with his mistress, the former diva Giuseppina Strapponi, which didn't go down too well with the local conservative townsfolk. Never one with much respect for the church, he exploded in anger in a letter to a friend. She has every right, both because of her conduct and character, to that consideration she habitually shows to others. They went to Paris for the next winter, with Verdi working on 2 new texts. For Rome, he was preparing Il Trovatore, based on a sprawling Spanish play. Whatever the shortcomings of the much-condensed version used in the opera, Trovatore is full of splendid music, including one of his best choruses, as a group of Spanish gypsies work at their anvils and then set off across the mountains. the Covent Garden Chorus and Orchestra, conducted by Lamberto Gardelli. Il Trovatore was another big hit at the Apollo Theatre, Rome, in January 1853. Verdi, meanwhile, was busy finishing the other commission. It could be hardly more different than Trovatore, La Traviata, a terse human drama set in contemporary society. However, he was very unhappy with the casting at Venice's La Fenice Theatre. They too became nervous and insisted on moving the period back to the days of Louis XIV. The opening night in March 1853 was simply a fiasco. The extremely stout heroine was laughed at when she tried to suggest she was dying of consumption. The opera was quickly dropped, but a year later another Venetian theatre, the San Benedetto, decided to stage the work. This time it was well cast, and La Traviata was an immediate hit, remaining Verdi's most popular opera ever since. Part of the Brindisi, with Ettore Gavatzfa, Jose Cura, and the cast of last year's live Paris television performance conducted by Zubin Mehta. Traviata is not just about the high life of a Parisian courtesan. The central character is based on a real person, and the opera recounts the girl's early and unhappy ending. Violetta's death scene is among the most harrowing moments in all opera. Here's Maria Callas in part of it, recorded live from the stage of the San Carlo Opera House in Lisbon in 1958.
Oh,
Maria Callas, caught on stage in her electrifying portrayal of the dying Violetta in La Traviata in Lisbon in 1958. A new commission arrived from the Paris Opera. This time Verdi settled on the Massacre of Italians by the French in Palermo in 1282, known as the Sicilian Vespers. The Parisians insisted on a full-scale grand opera in 5 acts with ballets, stage spectacles, the lot. A work for the Paris Opera, as he remarked, is enough to stun a bull. 5 hours of music. Phew! The piece went wrong from the start. He was unhappy with the text, the soprano vanished unannounced for holidays with her latest lover, and Verdi tried to cancel the project. No such luck, and Les Vêpres Siciliennes was seen at the Paris Opera in June 1855. It was another big success, but quickly faded from the repertory. La Fenice in Venice was looking for a premiere, and Verdi chose the tale of a 14th century doge in Genoa, Simone Boccanegra. But the Fenice was to remain his unlucky venue, and the opera wasn't much liked. He made major revisions to it 23 years later, and this version has returned to the repertory over the last 50 years as a dark but deeply moving drama. So, back to the King Lear project again. But a scheme to stage it in Naples fell through, and instead he turned his attention to the Swedish king Gustavus III, who died of wounds, having been shot at a masked ball in the 1770s. However, the official censor was most unhappy with the idea of killing a real historical king on stage, particularly after the recent attempt on the life of Napoleon III in Paris. After much wrangling, Verdi reset the story in America, with His Majesty becoming Ricardo, Count of Warwick, the governor of 17th century Boston, no less. The San Carlo contract fell through, and Un ballo in maschera was premiered at the Apollo in Rome in February 1859. It was a great success, and the first occasion the political slogan Viva Verdi was used. The Austrian authorities could not stop praise for the great composer, but Verdi, V-E-R-D-I, also stood for Vittorio Emanuele Re d'Italia. Long live Vittorio Emanuele, the King of Italy. The nationalist movement, the Risorgimento, was biting hard. Meanwhile, in August 1859, he decided to marry Giuseppina, and went to great trouble, for some unknown reason, maybe despite the locals, to keep it secret, journeying to a small town in Savoy for the ceremony and not revealing the fact until years later. 1861 saw the reunification of Italy, and Verdi was elected to the Assembly, a role he soon dropped, not being fond of political life. Resolved to take things easy, it took a commission from the Imperial Court in St. Petersburg to interest him in a new project. This time he chose a Spanish play, Don Alvaro or the Forces of Destiny, another of those vast panoramas popular at the time. Much difficulty was experienced in getting the new production off the ground, but finally the Verdis packed their bags, bringing plenty of pasta and salami in case Russian food was not to their liking, and the opera had its premiere in the winter of 1862 at the Imperial Theatre. It was a success, but Verdi wasn't so happy and revised the work twice, with the 1869 version being the one usually staged today. In the last scene, the heroine, who has retired to a convent, is welcomed by the local priest. Here's Rosa Poncel and Ezio Pinze in their famous 1928 recording. La Vergine dell'Angeli from La Forza del Destino, with Rosa Poncel and Ezio Pinza, recorded in 1928. Verdi was spending most of his time enjoying the life of a country squire, and it took an offer for the Great Exhibition in Paris 5 years later to tempt him back to work. For the fourth time he chose a play by Schiller, the not very historically accurate tale of Philip II of Spain and his son Don Carlo. Again, a large-scale five-actor was demanded, and the new work had its premiere at the Paris Opera in March 1867. The Empress Eugénie thought the work offensive, and though it achieved 43 performances, it wasn't deemed a success. 17 years later, he revised the score heavily, cutting it to 4 acts with an Italian text, the version usually seen today. Modern taste has swung back to favour Don Carlo with its fine music, as in this duet swearing eternal friendship between Carlo and his chum Rodrigo. Carreras and Capuccilli in Don Carlo from the Carrian recording. One of the 2 librettists from the opera, Camille Dulocle, kept pestering Verdi with new ideas, but the composer had decided he had enough. Then Dulocle gave him a scenario for a story of ancient Egypt. He knew that the Khedive of Egypt was keen to have a new opera for the opening of the Suez Canal and his new opera house in Cairo. However, plans were slow to mature, and the opera house opened with a revival of Rigoletto, and the canal was completed 2 weeks later and was opened by the Empress Eugénie in 1869. Meanwhile, the commission was agreed, and a gala premiere booked for January 1871. The score was ready well in advance, in fact, but then the Franco-Prussian War got underway, and the sets and costumes were trapped in Paris for a time. In the end, Aida had its premiere on Christmas Eve 1871 in Cairo. Verdi didn't travel to see it, but supervised the Italian premiere at La Scala 6 weeks later. He made stringent demands for his return to La Scala: no audience boxes on the stage, the orchestra was to be put in a sunken pit, the auditorium lights must be extinguished, and the cast had to meet his requirements. It was a glittering occasion, and the opera was an immediate hit. Indeed, Aida is almost a victim of its own success. The spectacle is so memorable that it's easy to forget that much of the story is an intimate human drama. Here's Aida, a Nubian princess enslaved in the Egyptian palace, pining for her homeland. Montserrat Caballé superb there as Aida, with the New Philharmonia Orchestra, conducted by Riccardo Muti, recorded in 1974. In the spring of 1873, Verdi's friend, the writer and nationalist Manzoni, died. As a tribute, he created a large-scale requiem, first heard in St. Mark's Cathedral, Milan in 1874. This time, Verdi, now 61, stated he'd finished writing operas. Some time later, his wily publisher, Ricordi, introduced him to a 37-year-old poet and composer, Arrigo Boito, to work on a revision of Simone Boccanegra, seen at La Scala in 1881. The two struck it off well, and Boito suggested he might provide a new libretto. Verdi gave in and decided on Shakespeare, not King Lear, which he continued to work on secretly, but instead Othello. It wasn't until March 1884 the 70-year-old composer started his manuscript, and by October 1885 it was ready. For the first time in 20 years, La Scala would have a Verdi world premiere, and a very different work it would prove to be. Any vestige of recitative alternating with set aria was gone. The score was tightly woven, continuous tapestry of music, scene blending into scene. The orchestral writing is detailed and imaginative, brilliantly reflecting the singer's words. It was a new peak in Italian opera. But he could still write a rousing scene. Here are Othello and Iago swearing eternal friendship in the famous 1947 Toscanini recording.
Si pel ciel marmorio giura, e a parte falconi, e la volte per l'oscuro al terminator, ira di impeto tremendo, resta via che salvi, questa me io devo spendo al tuo temor. Testimone il sol che ammiro, e mi radia l'anima, la mia terra il vasto cielo, oltre in ter, ad Otelio sacra ardene cuore, braccio ed anima, santa d'opere cruenti, mi sopra. Si per ciel marmorio giura, e la tante voltari, per la morte per l'oscuro mal terminator, ira di impetura e non tremare, questa via che sento, questa macchia devo stendo, via che sguardo, non di questa mare, manca chi volevo il stendo.
Ramon Vinay and Giuseppe Valdengo with the NBC Symphony Orchestra in the closing scene from Act 2 of Otello, under the fiery conducting of Arturo Toscanini, who'd played cello in the orchestra at La Scala 60 years earlier on opening night in 1887. Of course, everyone wanted another opera from the 73-year-old composer, but he preferred to retreat to his villa and his farm. He paid for a hospital in the area, but wouldn't allow his name to be used for it. 2 years later, out of the blue, Boito sent him a draft for a comic opera, based on Shakespeare's The Merry Wives of Windsor. After many hesitations and swearing Boito to absolute secrecy, Verdi got to work and had the score of Falstaff finished by 1892. Finally, they told Ricordi what they'd been up to, and the last Verdi opera had its first performance at La Scala in February 1893, the composer's 80th year. It's another huge success, and the pair talk about King Lear, and even a version of Antony and Cleopatra, but little progress is made. Verdi completed his 4 sacred pieces, his final compositions, but Giuseppina died in November 1897, and Verdi set up a trust, leaving his enormous wealth to a rest home for retired musicians, the Casa Verdi in Milan, where he and his wife are buried. Then, on January 21st, 1901, he suffered a stroke. And 7 days later, in the early hours of January 27th, 1901, on Mozart's birthday by happy chance, the 87-year-old composer died. He'd asked for a simple funeral, but a huge crowd turned out to sing Va Pensiero. How best to leave Verdi? Probably with the famous fugue that comes right at the end of Falstaff. The whole world is a joke, man was born a jester. Every human being laughs at everyone, but the best laugh of all is the one that comes last. The closing bars of Verdi's last opera in the Hungarian State Opera production conducted by Will Humberg. But Verdi wasn't the only 19th century composer of interest. Join me next week and we'll talk about the Verismo school. But for now, here's The Blue of the Night.
Con Anima is a collective invitation from the teaching staff of the Royal Irish Academy of Music to join them for a musical evening in support of the Hospitaller Order of St John of God on Thursday, December the 6th. The venue is the State Apartments of Dublin Castle and the time of the concert is 8 p.m. Presented by John O'Connor, it will feature the Academy Jazz Band and Chamber Orchestra, as well as many top names including Suzanne Murphy, Hugh Tinney and Aisling Drury-Byrne. Tickets are available from the Royal Irish Academy of Music at 01 676 4412. Presented in association with Lyric FM.